Welcome to Scaling Without Breaking podcast, the show for startup leaders who are done winging it and sick of everything being a bottleneck. Your team's growing, the cracks are showing, and what got you here is officially breaking. Each week, you'll hear raw stories, sharp strategies, and real talk from founders, operators, and advisors who've scaled through chaos and built companies that run without constant firefighting. If you're ready to start leading like a CEO and move beyond just surviving, you're in the right place. Here is your host, Roland Siebelink.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Scaling Without Breaking. Today I'm very honored to have a guest on the show that has tons and tons and tons of experience in this particular topic, how to scale without breaking. My guest built companies from $0 to $100 million over 20 years. He's had companies where he was the CEO, where he was the executive chairman, even companies that he walked away from. He wrote 5 books on the art of being a CEO, and the art of managing a board, the art of being a CXO, standards in the field. He has also advised hundreds of founders, and now he's back as CEO with fresh funding. But what I'm interested in is particularly how he codified the framework for how CEOs scale themselves so that they don't break. Everybody, meet my guest, and it's such an honor today, Matt Blumberg, the CEO of Markup AI.
Roland, how are you? Thank you so much for having me today. That was far more generous an introduction than I think I deserve.
Oh, no, not at all. I had to scale it down from all the suggestions that your CV would give me to, but of course I couldn't fill the whole podcast with just your introduction. That would have been too much. So Matt, as an opening question, let's dive right in. What does breaking look like for a CEO? And when did you almost break, maybe during your return path story?
So I think, what does breaking look like for a CEO? I think you can define it in a few different ways, right? One would be that you break. And, I've certainly seen CEOs who have literally break down, they're not capable of doing the job anymore, or they blow up and something bad happens. So there's the you break, there's the business breaks, and and then there's you get fired from the business because you've broken or the business breaks. And I don't think there's an answer, but there's sort of lots of answers. And to give you the sort of the second part of your question is like a time where I broke or almost broke. I don't know that I've ever broken in full, but there were certainly a couple times where I got close. And I think any CEO and any founder entrepreneur has stories like this. So the one that came to mind when you just asked me the question happened actually quite early in my tenure at my first true CEO job, which was Return Path. So I had been a GM for 5 years before that, leading a business inside of another business. But it was probably like a year in, maybe a little bit over a year, maybe 2 years, 2 years into running Return Path. We were post.com meltdown. So it's like late 2001. The business was really struggling. I mean, I started it in late 99. So the business was 2 years old in a market that was falling apart and melting all around us. And I was 29 years old or 30 years old. Like maybe I was 31. I don't know. I sort of knew what I was doing, but not really. And I'll never forget. What happened, which is we had just done basically an emergency merger with a direct competitor. And it was a save the business move. And we put 2 struggling companies together and cut half of both companies out. But then we got fresh funding from both VCs, and we were sort of, live to fight another day. My lead investor, a guy named Fred Wilson from Union Square Ventures, who has been a good friend of mine for 25 years. And we've done a bunch of different companies together. Fred came to me after a board meeting, and he said, he basically suggested that I get a coach. And today, coaches are everywhere, and coaching is mainstream. And having a coach as well as like a mentor, that's on my list of things that CEOs have to do to not break, right? To scale without breaking. So we can come back to that later if you want. But in 2001, it was actually really unusual to have a coach. And Fred came to me and he suggested I have a coach, and I kind of smiled and nodded and sent him away. And And I was like, all right, I guess I have to have a coach because, Boyd's telling me I have to have a coach. So I asked him for a couple of suggestions and he introduced me to some people. And I ended up hiring a coach who I worked with for almost 20 years and is a good friend to this day, whose name is Mark Maltz. He's fantastic. And so I meet with Mark to kick off the coaching. And Mark says, well, what do you think you need to work on? And my answer to him was, clearly I need to work on managing my board because they don't understand why I'm right all the time, or something like
that. That sounds like a 31-year-old for sure, right?
First timer, and Mark in a very wise way said, "Oh, that's interesting. Why don't we start with a 360, and we'll see what everyone else thinks you need to work on." And sort of very gently pivoted me away from that. And obviously the answer was not that I needed to do a better job of convincing the board that I was right. And that sort of started me on a journey in lots of different ways. But my point, and to answer a long answer to your question of like a time I almost broke, I was probably pretty close to breaking them, but I don't think I knew it at the time.
Yeah, that's very common, right?
Yeah, you really don't. And it wasn't until I started deeply working with Mark and understanding the feedback from a very comprehensive 360 process, and really looking in the mirror instead of looking out the window, as I think Jim Collins says. It wasn't until that I realized, first of all, that I had probably been pretty close to breaking, and that like if I wanted to be a scaled CEO and a scaled operator, and not just the entrepreneur who like starts it and hands it off and starts it and hands it off and starts it and hands it off, that I had to do things very differently. And, it took me 10 years to figure out what that meant, at least comprehensively. I probably figured out bits and pieces of it along the way.
Well, you became famous for this list of 10, 11 points of how to scale yourself as a CEO, right? And some of the points you mentioned, like have both a coach and a mentor, gather feedback, and incorporate that feedback are all parts of that list. What is the key thing that you want to convey from that list to CEOs? Like the overall message, if there's just a one-liner or an elevator pitch in a sense.
Yeah, because it's not the bullet points. Like I'm happy we can talk through some of the bullet points if you want, but if there's an overall message, it's that most people can scale really far as operators. Not necessarily everybody. There are people who are just temperamentally not suited to be scaled operators, and they should go start the next business and the next business and the next business, and they're brilliant and they're creative. And there's nothing wrong with that. But most people can be scaled operators, and most people can scale a lot farther than you think they can. And most people can scale a lot farther than they think they can themselves. But you have to want to do it, and you have to be willing to put in the hard work to get there. And so it starts by caring about being a scaled operator that doesn't break. And it starts by being, as what I call sort of a student of the craft. So you have to care about scaling without breaking, and you have to learn what that means. And that could be reading or listening, however you consume media. Read biographies of Steve Jobs and Jack Welch and Warren Buffett. Listen to the Acquired podcast. Read Harvard Business Review. Read a whole bunch of blogs, right? So you got to read, listen, you have to study it. You have to distill the learnings. You have to discuss them with other people, and you have to figure out how to apply them to you. So that's the main message is almost anyone can scale without breaking, but you got to put in the work.
Yeah, it really chimes with me. Like the reason why we started this mid-stage accelerator almost 10 years ago was really the frustration we had with VCs just replacing a founder CEO too quickly in our minds, and not even giving them the chance to grow up in a sense, or to scale, as you call it. But of course, there's also the other side that many CEOs are kind of trying to stay too much of an early startup CEO and are not yet ready to change themselves and to move with the adaptation of the business that the business needs, right? Why do you think it breaks so much at that point between, let's say, 30 and 100 employees? Why does everything break at that stage?
Well, That's probably the time at which, for most first-time CEOs, they stop knowing everything that happens in the organization. And by the way, that's probably true of any team. Like if you're working as a middle manager at a large company, like if you have 20 people under you in a couple of layers, you probably know everything that's going on, but by the time you have 40, you don't.
And that's been what you've relied on to be successful, right? That knowing everything and being basically the only one connecting the dots.
Knowing everything, being the only one that connects the dots. And quite frankly, for most CEOs, being better at almost everyone's job than they are. I mean, not all of them and not all the time, but there's a lot of that.
Especially early on when you probably didn't have that much choice in who you could afford to hire. I mean, it might have been some friends from college or something, right?
Well, yeah. And look, if you're a technical founder, you probably wrote the first code base. And if you're a non-technical founder like me, you architected the entire organization and the strategy and everything else. So yeah, I mean, but I think you hit it. It's like knowing more than anybody else and being the hub of the hub and spoke. And then that breaks down. And if you can't figure out how to get past that, then you've broken and not scaled.
What are the points in your framework that help CEOs, founders run particularly through that phase? So you already mentioned be a student of the craft. So not just identify as an entrepreneur, as a founder, but also as a CEO and wanting to be a CEO, I guess, right?
Yeah. Well, look, there are lots and lots of points about you as the CEO and like self-management, and we can talk about all those. But let me start with the one that's not about you, which is, as a CEO, you have two teams. You have your board above you, and you have your leadership team below you. And both of those teams also need to scale, and they need to constantly be leveled up and recalibrated to the current and forward-looking needs of the business. And as the CEO, if you're not doing that, first of all, you're failing in your job, but you are also unable to scale. If you have a weak team underneath you that was the right team for 2 million in revenue and not the right team for 10 going to 20, you cannot scale because you're constantly filling holes in your own team.
What comes first there? This seems to me such a chicken and egg problem, right? Like a CEO who's like micromanaging, all controlling, does not attract the kind of people at a higher level. But then again, if they don't have that team, they don't know how to delegate and they don't dare to.
Yeah, I mean, there's no answer to the chicken and the egg problem, the beginning of it is acknowledging that you don't have the right people, or acknowledging that you don't have one of the right people or two of the right people. It's not that your whole team needs to be replaced every couple of years, but you have to be maniacally focused on scaling up the quality of your team. And that might mean replacing people, or it might mean helping them invest in their own scalability. So, at Return Path, which was a 20-year run, we had almost the same management team from like 2 or 5 million in revenue up to 75.
Oh, that's rare.
Really unusual. But the only reason that worked is that all of us were committed to scaling, and we made that part of our operating system as a leadership team, and we invested in it. And we're really deliberate about it and really intentional about it and held each other accountable to that. So, eventually that started breaking down, but we went a long way, sort of the core 5 or 6 executives.
Can you illustrate a little bit how you made that part of your operating system? Because, I mean, everyone says they do, but I'd love to get some concrete points on how far did you push that?
Yeah, I can do that. And then I want to make sure we come back to the point about scaling your board too, because that's also important. So I would say the first thing we did as a leadership team is I made the decision that the coach that I was working with, Mark, who I mentioned before, was not just my coach. He was the leadership team's coach. And that meant 2 things. One is he coached people on the team individually. And basically everyone knew like there was a tab open at the bar. Like you could use Mark anytime you wanted. But he also was responsible for coaching our team as a team. And look, that costs money. There's no question about that. And we decided it was worth investing in a real retained model with him. And he was very present. He came to every weekly staff meeting. He didn't come to the dailies, but he came to the weeklies. He came to all hands meetings, and he came to quarterly offsites that the exec team did. So he was an adjunct to the whole team. And then we ran a lot of instruments, that sort of the psychometric instruments, and did a lot of exercises with the team about scaling ourselves as a leadership team. And Mark did a lot of work to like tell us how we were showing up with the organization, how we were showing up with the board. So that's sort of that was the principal investment that we made. The second investment that we made, which mirrors some of the other things on my list about CEOs, right? And I always say CEOs need lots of things, but including they need a coach, they need a mentor, and they need a peer group. And so I encouraged every one of my C-level executives who I gave them a coach, but I also encouraged them to find mentors and peer groups. And not all of them did all of the time, but a lot of them did a lot of the time. And, when your CRO is trying to scale and has a much more seasoned and experienced CRO that you're paying as a mentor, you're giving them a couple stock options or even doing it informally, that's really helpful. When your CMO joins the Pavilion chapter locally and has a peer group or goes through some other method of getting one, or even doing, something with one of the VC portfolios you're in, like that's really, really helpful. So I would say on the management team front, those are some of the concrete things that we did.
Okay. Before we go into the board that you'd still wanted to talk about, of course, I would like to hear your insight in why in particular did you land on they need all three? Because almost everyone else would say you either need a coach or a mentor or a peer group, whatever floats your boat in a way, right? Why all three?
Because you get different things out of them. So I'll give you the most succinct definitions I can. A great coach helps you be the best version of yourself, particularly when it comes to human interactions and leadership. A great coach could coach anyone. They could coach a head of sales, a head of technology, a CEO. A mentor, a better way of calling it, is a functional mentor. A functional mentor is someone who has done your job at a more senior level in your company and can help teach you the stuff about your job that you've never done before. Like a coach can't really do that unless you have a coach that also used to be a CEO or a CRO or whatever. And then a peer group is just a place to vent, and it's a place to share current learnings, best practices, think of that as like the river of information as opposed to like point in time work.
And it seems like together with the psychometric instruments you also mentioned, like it's really optimized for giving people tons and tons of feedback about their performance and almost challenge in terms of looking again at yourself, reflecting more, setting the bar higher.
Absolutely. And that's another point that I would make that I think is so important, is getting great at feedback. And I don't mean giving feedback, although yes, you have to be good at giving feedback if you want to scale up your team. You have to get great at getting feedback. And, I have a really simple formula with feedback. One, ask for it. That's where it has to start. Most CEOs don't ask for it, right? So you have to ask for it. You have to create a place for people to give feedback, which could take lots of different forms. Two is you have to accept it gracefully. And gracefully means you don't argue, you don't debate it, you don't sit there with a scowl on your face and your arms crossed. You thank people for the feedback and you write it all down.
Which doesn't necessarily mean you agree with it, as I always say.
The third thing you have to do is process it. And processing it means you have to internalize it, and then you have to figure out which parts make the most sense. When you get a 360 and your board's giving you feedback, your management team's giving you feedback, you get a lot of information. And the reality is nobody sees your job the way you see your job. And it's easy for the board to say more accountability for results. And it's easy for your team to get annoyed because they didn't get, their way with something or other. And that doesn't mean you get to discount all of the feedback, but it does mean that you have the ability to process it and to internalize it and to figure out which pieces of it are most important and most actionable. And then the next step is act on it. And then the next step is ask for it again. I heard you. How am I doing? Thank you for the feedback.
How much acting do you recommend, especially if you get a plethora of feedback? Of course, in your processing, you'll filter a lot of it already. But what's your general recommendation on how much change can you process at one point in time or incorporate it at one point in time?
I mean, it kind of depends what the feedback is, but I always say the best development plans, so the best distillation of feedback has like no more than 3 points on it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And sometimes one. Like if there's one big thing you got to work on, focus on one big thing, but it's really hard to do more than a few. And the trick of processing feedback is figuring out how to prioritize it and make it actionable. And a good coach who runs a good 360 process for you will help you do that. But you got to do, I mean, at the end of the day, like a coach is your helper and enabler, but it's you. It's not up to the coach to write your development plan. That means you have not internalized the feedback.
And if the coach tries to advise you too much or do the work for you, then they're probably not the best coach you could get, right?
Yeah, that's right. They're not the best coach you can get. And that sort of comes back to my very, very first point, which is you have to do the hard work.
How about, before, I still want to talk about the board, but the last point I wanted to ask about the management team is, to what extent did you also invest in the systematic approach of managing the company? Frameworks probably before they were called OKRs, things like a one-page strategic plan, the offsites you already mentioned. How much of the systematization did you guys commit to at that stage?
Yeah, a lot, and more as we got bigger. And we changed them too. It wasn't like we just kept adding to the pile. Like we would swap things in and swap things out. But, the job of scaling up a company and an organization is the job of systematizing things. And the job of building, kind of programmatic ways of working. So frameworks become incredibly important, and they drive the whole business forward. So the planning cycle, which includes, goals and reporting and OKRs or whatever you want to call them, that becomes like the lifeblood of the company. I refer to those things as like the operating system of the company. And you have to invest in those. Otherwise you have chaos. And again, it sort of gets to the size of the organization. When you got 20 people, everyone kind of knows what everyone's doing, and you can stand in the middle of the room or on a Zoom where you know everybody and say, okay, everybody, we're going that way.
And the trust is still there by default, right? Like it's just there by osmosis in a sense.
Yeah, but it's not just about trust. It's also like everyone kind of knows. Like everyone knows what they're doing. Everyone knows what the person next to them is doing. And that does break down at some point if you don't create structures and mechanisms for people to really be able to connect the dots on their own, to be able to, kind of function in a high throughput way, then things break down. So investing in things like your, all these I would bucket under operating systems. Some of them are actual software systems, and some of them are just routines or practices. But, understanding the cycle of quarterly planning and reporting is really important. Information flow is another huge piece of it, and making sure that people have the information they need about where the business is going and what their contribution is along the way just helps them do a better job of making decisions along the way. So, I've always felt like you want to get the organization to a place where people can self-manage as much as possible. And that's just a much more efficient way of operating than needing, command and control at every level and small spans of control because managers have to micromanage. It's just not efficient. It's also no fun.
I love how you frame it with like the ability for people to connect their dots for themselves. And it chimes with me because just the other day I was talking with the CEO of about 150, 200 people company. And he's so obsessed with, I have to explain this to people more. I have to explain this. And of course, that goes in conflict with that stage. You probably want to manage a lot more through asking questions rather than by dumping your brain onto people, right? How do you feel about that balance?
About asking versus telling?
Explaining versus just telling.
Yeah. I mean, look, one of the things I say, which it sounds self-contradictory, but is not, is as you scale, you have to spend less time talking and you have to spend more time talking. And what I mean by that, I'll actually take it in the reverse order. You have to spend more time doing kind of mass communication. And, as I always say, by the time you're sick of hearing your own voice about something, it's just the message is just starting to sink in.
So it's just endless repetition of like a core message, right? That you're talking about.
You have to do a lot of the same message, over and over and over. So that's spending more time talking. But you also have to spend less time talking and more time asking questions. And what I mean by that is the farther away you get from the front lines, because your organization is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the more you actually need to understand what's going on in the business in order to be an effective leader. And you don't get that by hearing your own voice. You only get that by hearing from other people. So that doesn't mean that like there's not a role for you to steer the ship. But what it means is that the percentage of time you spend telling people what to do as opposed to asking them what they're learning and what they're doing has to flip from like 80-20 to 20-80, and in a sliding scale over time as the business grows.
And you're often surprised, in my experience, that when you do give people the opportunity, they will actually come up with plans that might have been even more brilliant than yours.
One of my favorite business books was written by my friend Jeff Lawson, who was the founder of Twilio. And the book is called Ask Your Developer. And Twilio's whole business was like, when Jeff started, it was like producing developer APIs, right? But his whole point in the book, and it's not just true of developers, but that's the best example I can point to. Jeff's whole point and his whole brilliance is, if you tell someone to do something and how to do it, they'll probably follow your instructions. If you ask them to solve a problem, they might or might not do it the way you want them to do it, but they're going to get it done. They're going to be happier. They're going to be more productive. And the likelihood that they come up with a better way of doing it than you could have told them to do in the first place is pretty high. And that is certainly true as the organization gets bigger.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Matt, time to finally move to the board. You wanted to talk about boards. You said, let's scale up the board as much as the team below you as a CEO, right? So what is your experience with board membership, management, I would say, board management? The thing that many CEOs struggle with most, some of them don't even see it as a separate activity, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can talk about boards for hours. We did write a whole book about boards. So I'll just make 2 points here about boards, and we can maybe save that for a separate conversation if you'd like. The first point is that your board, just like your executive team, also needs to be leveled up over time. And that requires active management. Having independent directors is critical to most companies' success. A board cannot just be founders and VCs. You don't get enough perspective, and you're just missing some critical things. But the independent directors you probably need to change over time, because the needs of the business change over time and the complexion of the business changes over time. And, the first independent board member you have might be a product manager at a partner company, but a board member you need 2 years later is a CEO that has scaled a business like yours to 20 million in revenue. And you have to be really intentional about scaling up the composition of your board. And that's true with investors as well. Early stage investors shouldn't stay on boards too long, because the patterns that they match and the advice that they give stops being relevant as companies grow and change. So being an active, hands-on leader of the board with robust independence and scaling up the composition over time is sort of the first point I would make about boards. And the second point is, I think every CEO should try to sit on another board. I've always sat on, actually usually multiple boards in addition to my own. And I just find that the value that I get out of being on someone else's board is disproportionate probably to the value they get out of me. I try to be a great board member, and I try to add value wherever I can. But when I sit in someone else's board meeting, I come away with as many notes for myself as I do for them. And just seeing another company operate, seeing another CEO's daily struggles, seeing how another board works, seeing how another management team works, all that stuff just gives you ideas. So it sort of comes back to my Uber point about, you have to be a student of the craft, and you have to care what people are doing. You have to read and listen to podcasts. Sitting on someone else's board fits into that routine as well.
Why is the best practice you prescribe here so different from what we see in almost all growing startup companies? Not enough independent directors, too many investors on the board, maybe too much polarization between investors and the founders when the things go wrong. Why is it not working better?
I think fundamentally, most CEOs, look, you have an N of 1 when you're a first-time founder. Most CEOs with an N of 1 don't know what great looks like on a board. And quite frankly, a lot of VCs don't know what great looks like on a board either. The good ones do, for sure. And it feels like an add-on. It feels like a burden. It feels like it's not core. It feels like it doesn't help. And 9 out of 10 CEOs that I talk to, you talk about their board and they roll their eyes and they're like, next topic, please. But when you get it right with a board, you have a force multiplier for the success and scalability of your business and of you as a CEO. But you don't get it right by accident. You have to, like everything else, you got to do the work. You got to put the time into the board composition and also into board leadership and management. And what I have found over time is that when you get it right, not only are you spending a lot less incremental time on it because it becomes part of how you run the company, but the value you get out of it goes up like 10x.
Is it because founders subconsciously treat the board too much like their boss?
Probably. I think it's that they treat their board as a burden, as an afterthought. Like, I have to report to these guys. I have to do all this work to produce something that they're not going to read. And then they're going to come sit in a meeting and do email the whole time.
And then yet they're obsessed of getting the font right in the presentation on all 100 pages, like how do you even fix a situation like that?
Well, you fix the situation by deciding that you want to get a lot out of your board, and you work backwards from that. So if I want to get a lot out of my board, you have to decide you want to get a lot out of your board with the minimal amount of effort.
I like that framing.
When you get those two things right, all of a sudden you look forward to your board meetings because you're like, oh my God, I got the brain trust around for 6 hours. What are we going to get out of them? And the lift to prepare goes way down. And like I said, there's a whole other podcast we could do about that, and I'm happy to come back on and talk about it.
Of course. And I'll invite you back because this is not going to fit into one episode for sure. So I'm looking forward to the next one already. 2 more questions I wanted to ask about the board maybe. One is you have your independent directors as an important variable. How does that compare to members of your board of advisors in your mind?
I've never been a big fan of a board of advisors. I love having a customer advisory board. That's different, right? That's like a product thing or marketing thing. I've never really had success with boards of advisors. Occasionally I've had an advisor or two who add value, but every time I've marched into a board of advisors, I feel like that is another thing. I've just always gotten more success about having a couple good independents on the board, on the real board. And then if I need an advisor one-off for something, I do that. But otherwise that does become yet another thing on your plate. Okay.
And you also have the 1-1-1 framework, right? Can you explain that to us?
I can, although just to tie off on the last question, what I would say is a time where you might want to have a board of advisors is if you have a dysfunctional board and you can't do anything about it.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you are structurally unable to get what you need out of a good board, then sure, think about creating essentially a shadow.
Building a separate power center next to it in a sense, right?
Yeah, but my rule of ones is sort of what I said earlier. I just didn't articulate it that way, which is build independent directors into your board from day one. Only one member of the management team on the board, no other founders. Then the last point is for every one VC, make sure you have one independent.
Oh, why is that? Tell me more about that.
And the fundamental reason for only one member of the management team on the board is you have a limited number of slots. You already have 100% of the mind share of your co-founders. So they're just occupying a seat. And again, if you care about the strategic advice you're getting from your co-founder is going to be in the room for the board meeting anyway. If you care about the quality of strategic advice you're getting from the board, someone who's not in the business every day is going to give you different advice than someone who is. So that's really what that comes down to. And, governance, you can set governance in a different direction if you want. If the founders own the business, you don't have to give the board the right to fire all the founders. Feel free to separate shareholder governance from board governance.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. Well, Matt, this has been an amazing podcast. It definitely feels like we should do a lot more recording. So I'll get you invited one more time with your permission, of course. But in the meanwhile, people who want to know more about your books in particular and all the amazing stuff you're telling us, where should they go and what can they download?
So the 3 books, which are on Amazon, and they're not all on audio, but they're all on ebook, are Startup CEO, Startup CXO, and Startup Boards. And I'm obviously a big digital person. I kind of recommend getting the hard copy. And the reason I recommend getting the hard copy is they function, you can read them front to back, but they also kind of function as reference material. Like the books have hundreds of small chapters with specific topics. And I don't know, sometimes it's helpful to thumb through the table of contents if you're having a bad day. And it's just a little easier if it's physically sitting on your desk. So those are the 3 books. My email address is matt@markup.ai, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to chat with people or trade emails where I can be helpful.
Yeah, and of course, people who know me already and don't know Matt yet, I'm always happy to provide an introduction. So this has been an amazing recording, Matt. Thank you so much for coming on to the Scaling Without Breaking podcast, and looking forward to the next episode.
Absolutely. Good to talk to you, Roland. Thanks.
The Scaling Without Breaking podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.